Good evening, everyone, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS Episode 4. And in this episode, we're going to be speaking about inflation and all things inflation. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kieran Van Sweden. Hello, Kieran. How are you doing?
Hi, William. I'm good.
Brilliant to see you tonight. I think, is it fair to say that this is your favourite interview to date?
Yeah, I think this is it's the most good-humored one so far.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was great because he's covered such a confusing topic, but in such a light, funny, kind of meandering, but coming back to the point way. So yeah, I really enjoyed it as well. We'll show the interview in a minute or so. It's with John T. Harvey, who calls himself the Cowboy Economist, and he's based in Texas, and really good. Some of his views on inflation were really kind of jaw-dropping to me, and I'm sure you're going to have so many things to talk about once you've seen the interview. Kieran, are you ready for this?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Brilliant. Right, well, I'll see you in a bit once we've seen the video. I hope everyone enjoys this.
So you're a professor in Texas, and we want to ask you lots of questions about inflation. So I think the first one we should start with is, can you give us a definition of what inflation actually is?
Yes, I can, which would have made for a very short interview if I'd opened with no. It's just an average increase in the price of goods and services. What they do is, it's actually kind of interesting that they survey people to see what they buy in an average month, for example. I assume it's the same way in the UK. And then they track those prices over time. And the inflation numbers you see, for example, that were just released in the US today, is simply an average of the increase or decrease of those prices. Today, it indicated that US prices of goods and services had increased by 5.4% over the past year. And the big chunk of that was just used cars. So, you have to break it down and see, oh my gosh, that everything's more expensive. No, that's not true. And if you're not in the market for a used car, it's not really going to affect you at all. But it's just an average increase in prices. It does not include stock prices or anything like that. However, you can have spillover from such things. It's quite possible to have an increase in oil prices, for example, just because oil price futures get bid up because people decide to speculate in that market. But nevertheless, the inflation figures you see are just for goods and services, and they are based on, hopefully, a representative set of goods that people tend to buy on a monthly basis. And of course, they update that over time. No one buys 8-track tape players anymore, for example. So we can drop that one out safely.
I wanted to go through the things that you said in the Forbes article, which I thought were very succinct and very clear when you're talking about inflation. I think the point you've just made is that people have to bear in mind when they say when inflation is going up, they really have to look inside that and what that actually means, rather than just take it as, everything's going up. So
Right.
what you said, first of all, in that article is that inflation doesn't hurt everyone because it's a redistribution, not a net loss of income. So could you elaborate on that?
I could indeed for many hours. However, I will do my best to hold it shorter than that. Let me back up into the wrong view first, and that is the common view that it hurts everyone. And this, I think, comes from a couple of places. One, for those of us that grew up in the 70s and 80s, the increase in gas prices, oil prices, did feel like it hurt everybody. But then, of course, it wasn't hurting the oil industry and the people who were selling the oil. But I'll come back to that. And second, I think this whole view of it hurts everyone, therefore we must desperately stop it. And I'm not a big conspiracy theorist, but it sure is a convenient way for neoliberal types to argue that when the economy is expanding and wages are finally being bid up, and yes, that's going to be inflationary when the people that work at the fast food places are going to be paid more, then yes, your hamburgers are going to be more expensive. And when they outlawed slavery in the United States, cotton became more expensive. But you know what? Who cares? All right, that wasn't the point. So these people have, and I can make the case here for the U.S. in particular, are paid very poorly. And at the end of an expansion, when there's a labor shortage and we bid up the price of labor, oh no, say the neoliberal economists, who are both Republicans and Democrats, we've got to throw the economy into recession. Well, and if I can sell this as it's hurting everyone, then everyone's behind it. And that's exactly how people are feeling right now. Oh no, there's this inflation that's hurting everyone. And so we've had a pattern, at least since Reagan Thatcher, so many horrible patterns since Reagan Thatcher, of, every time the economy seems to be, all right, now we're really moving. And then the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England tries to slow everything down again. So first of all, the wrong view is rooted, I think, in the historical experience of many of us from the oil crisis, because we were oil importing countries. And also from this Milton Friedman neoliberal view of the government's, keep our hands off and inflation is a terrible, horrible thing. So we need to throw the economy into recession, which really hurts the working class more than anyone else, at least at that point of an expansion, if that's the cause of the inflation. So the right view is, and what I had suggested when I was given the example of the 1970s and 80s inflation, clearly everyone wasn't worse off. Clearly, there were people who were gaining tremendously from this. Inflation, you should always ask yourself, who's getting richer and who's getting poorer? Now, was it true that oil exporting countries were also having to pay more for their Mercedes because of the inflation? Well, yeah. But I mean, if your income goes up by 50% and the prices you pay go up by 10%, you're much better off. All right. So this now you might think to yourself, oh gosh, I'm paying 10% more. I could be even wealthier. Yeah, but the deal is you caused the inflation by withholding the oil, which drove up the prices, which made Texas a very popular place to be because of the oil industry here. We naturally moved here after the oil industry collapsed, and so things were very bad. Inflation isn't an equal increase in prices everywhere. It's never going to do that. And I always find this funny that certainly this isn't true of MMT scholars, but of supporters of MMT, we're always big on, hey, if the government has a deficit, then somebody else has to have a surplus. Why don't we say that with inflation? Hey, if I'm paying more, somebody's getting more. It's impossible for that not to be true.
The second thing that you brought up in that article as well is that inflation triggers useful changes in production and consumption patterns. Could you elaborate on that point?
Yes, that's exactly the thing with the distilleries, is that what happened was when the prices went up for the alcohol, for the medicinal alcohol, maybe I'll distinguish it that way, then people shifted away from the drinking alcohol that they've been producing, which was a shame because we all needed a lot of that. And that's exactly what we wanted. In the 1970s, during the oil crisis, apparently the price of ceiling fans went way up because there was suddenly a huge demand to put, and I wish I had one in this room because Texas is very hot, but ceiling fans, well, okay. I mean, we wanted more ceiling fans. Ceiling fans became more profitable and more ceiling fans were created. Now, there's absolutely a reason to want to resist increases in prices for things that are, sort of essentials, like housing, for example. I mean, we certainly, I'm not making a case for, oh, the market's wonderful, keep the government out, but I am saying that it's strange that mainstream economics, one of the few times that the market does something that makes sense, they try to intervene and stop it. They try to throw the economy into recession because, oh no, it's heating up. So that is the issue, that when the prices for these things go up right now, as I mentioned earlier, a big part of the increase in inflation in the US, and I was just looking at the numbers, I believe the price of used cars has increased by 45% over the past year, which is really remarkable. Well, it's going to cause more cars to be produced, right? So what do people want? They wanted more cars. Now, on the other hand, housing prices are going up here. And actually, Karen, I think you were talking about this earlier. A lot of it is just speculation. That we don't want. That is not people wanting to live in homes, driving up the price and creating more homes for people to live in. Yeah, it can trigger useful changes in consumption and production patterns. Again, I'm not saying inflation's good. I'm saying inflation is like a fever when someone's sick. All right, it's a symptom of something else. All right, so you need to find out what's going on. And if the fever is from your body fighting off an infection, oh, well, we'll wait till the fever is done and it will have accomplished something positive. If it's from some sort of infection that your body is losing the battle to, then no, we want to stop that. But the inflation itself is only a symptom. And it can be a symptom of something that's actually a useful process.
Oh, I like that. I like any kind of anatomical analogy. That always works for me. Now, you've kind of touched on this as well, but I do want to segregate these points out for the audience. And the third one, inflation can result from socially beneficial developments like rising wages. So you have touched on this. Again, could you maybe give us a little bit more information?
Yeah. One of the things that's really handy that you can look up from MIT is they create a spreadsheet of living wages for every county, I believe every county in the United States. And it's very conservative in how much it's assuming people will spend. When I go over these data in class, I say, look, they're assuming that people spend $8 a day on food. All right. So can you get away with that? Yeah, but you don't supersize it at McDonald's because you won't be able to afford it anymore. So let's say that, and what I would really like, of course, is a job guarantee is the way I would like to see us address the unemployment problem and the problem of the working class. But let's say we just increase minimum wage. All right, it's a big debate in the U.S. right now. Is that inflationary? Of course it is. Of course it's going to be more expensive to make a hamburger or whatever. But if we have an industry that has to depend on starvation wages to exist, then it shouldn't exist. And so there was a whole war fought about that over here, that there was an industry that wasn't going to be profitable if they weren't allowed to own other human beings. So, well, okay, then it shouldn't exist. But of course, if we increase minimum wage, that's going to cause the price of hamburgers and French fries and so forth to go up. Okay. I mean, if you want these people to be paid better, there is a cost. Now, it also means that we're going to have less dependence on social services. We're going to have people who can take some pride in their lives. We're going to have less crime and so forth. So, but every policy shouldn't have to end up being it benefits me, monetarily or whatever. It wouldn't benefit me. I mean, I'm a college professor, so I get to have cheap gardening and cheap, food at restaurants and so forth. It would become more expensive. But yes, it can absolutely result from socially useful processes.
The fourth point you made as well is that increasing the money supply doesn't cause inflation. Again, can you elaborate on that for the audience?
Yes, that's something I used to teach because I learned it that way. And it's interesting, those of us coming from this perspective, almost all of us learned the mainstream view, and that's almost all we learned. And we had to most of the people who felt like we did quit the program. They're like, well, in fact, I remember early on thinking, this is insane. I'm learning about a model where it describes the Great Depression as people quit their jobs on purpose. It was all voluntary unemployment. And this is one of Milton Friedman's models. And so I thought, what am I doing here? But then we found these other things. And so I have taught in the past that increase in the money supply causes inflation. But then, finally read enough post-Keynesian work, which of course is the work inspired by Keynes, which is not the same as Keynesian. Keynesian is the, as Joan Robinson said, the bastardized version of what Keynes said. But think about that. This is Milton Friedman's explanation of why increasing the money supply causes inflation, right? It's from a classic article that I had to read in grad school, Optimum Quantity Theory of Money, something like that. Okay, so he sets up an island. Let's say there's this island, and that's fine. I mean, we all do little examples like this. I'm not criticizing for that. We all have to make simplifying assumptions. Everyone on the island already has a job, so we're at full employment. Everyone already has as much savings as they'd like to have, as much of their savings in cash as they would like to have. So they don't really want any more cash. But then the central bank comes in and flies a helicopter. He said, let's just say a helicopter flies over. And at that point, you just say, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense because the Federal Reserve is about to, or the central bank is about to engage in an act it can't engage in the real world. And I don't just mean dropping it out of a helicopter, but I'll get back to that. But I just want to point that out as a place where we have to come back to. So he says the helicopter flies over, drops all the money out, and people already had as much cash as they wanted. So when they got this new cash, they had an excess. What do we call it? Excess money balances. And I've seen Paul Krugman use these concepts as well. Excess money balances. and then we go out and spend them. And then that cost, and remember, we were already at full employment by assumption, even though we were rarely at full employment. And then all we did was bid up prices, right? So therefore, don't do that. All right, well, above and beyond the assumption of full employment, what the helicopter pilot in that example did was increase people's income. That's fiscal policy. That's not monetary policy. Monetary policy only changes one asset from one form to another. If I'm the U.S. Federal Reserve and I'm engaging in an open market purchase so that I have brand new dollar bills I want in the economy, I buy treasury bills from you, all right? So you're no wealthier than you were before. And so as a now it's possible that you may take those dollars and go and spend them, but there's no such thing as I gave you more cash than you wanted. And that's the whole core of the monetarist argument and what's derived from that, just in general, that we can give people more cash than they wanted, and then they'll spend it and cause inflation. If you take that out, the whole thing falls apart. It's impossible to give people money they don't want. Now, fiscal policy can cause inflation, but as it did during World War II in the United States, when we were at full employment and still spending, it caused terrible inflation. It would have if it hadn't been for wage and price controls. No, monetary policy can't. You cannot give people money they don't want. Therefore, you cannot give them excess money balances. It's very interesting. The economics discipline in the U.S. sees interest rates as terribly important. If we lower those, the economy takes off. If we raise them, the economy collapses. And yet, when they do empirical research on it, they find that, for example, with firms building new investment, they don't care that much about interest rates. They'd rather have lower than higher, but they don't care that much. The real key here is that printing money and using monetary policy to inject it into the economy is not inflationary. Printing money and having the government spend it as fiscal policy, as the United States did during World War II, absolutely can be. But that's not their argument. Their argument is all about monetary policy. But that is the bottom line, monetary policy. And if you look for money growth can't cause inflation in Forbes and John Harvey, you'll see that piece that I wrote years ago now that kind of went over all the issues involved.
I was born in 1974 in Scotland, and the level of inflation that year was 16.4%. And it's been really interesting hearing you talk about this, because inflation has, for my whole life, been this bogeyman, that it is the thing that derails economies. And I'm sure there is still truth behind that. And, we hear these examples of what's happened in other countries and at other times. But asking you to kind of look back on those 40 years, since the mid 70s, did we take the correct actions to curb inflation in the West, or should we have done something completely different?
That's a very good question. Let me say, first of all, I speak to a lot of civic groups, the Unitarian Church has a little, group and so forth. So anyway, I have a whole file of PowerPoints that I use to give presentations. And one of them is on inflation and all the people in the US who were saying after the financial crisis that we're about to have hyperinflation because of the Federal Reserve, monetizing the US deficit spending and so forth. And when you look at the data, this was after the financial crisis, and on it was one of the lowest periods of inflation since World War II. All right, so that didn't happen. And and when I use this in class, I show my students, and I have it broken down by decade. I said, if you really wanted to understand inflation, what decade would you really want to know about? Well, the 1970s, because you can see it right there. It has the highest rate. Like, I want to know about that. I'm curious about that. What happened there? So absolutely, that is a very key time. I was 13 in 1974, which means that I was learning to drive in 77, and gas prices were through the roof and I couldn't drive. They could have limited the supply of oil at any time. There was no reason why they had to wait until 1973. But there was always this interesting political problem. Let's say the three of us are, dominate the oil market. And we are all going to agree to reduce the total supply of oil to X. Well, I want as big a chunk of that X as I can get. We're going to be driving the price way up. So none of us really wants to cut back that much, because if the other two of you cut way back and I don't, I'm filthy rich. You've helped drive the price up by cutting back on how much oil you're pumping out of the ground, and I get to win. So after the war, though, they were like, tell me where to sign. All right, we're ticked off. We're not going to let this happen again, and we're going to let the West know what we mean business in a different way. So we have a tripling of oil prices and so forth. Now, how do you fight that? You certainly do not do what the United States did in the Volcker recession. All right. So the 82 recession was caused on purpose by the Federal Reserve in the US because it was dominated by monetarists. And they were trying to throw the economy into a deep recession, which they greatly succeeded at. It was the worst recession since the Great Depression. And as far as the height of that, it was still worse than the financial crisis recession, although the financial crisis one was longer. So they did this on purpose, all right, to try to get rid of the inflation. Now, what is that going to accomplish? I'm a consumer and I got to go out and buy gas that's, much more expensive. And then that price, of course, the price of gas filters into so many other products as well, because people have to be shipped by, use, fuel to ship things and so forth. But I know this is going to help a bunch of you who are about to be out of work. Well, no, that doesn't help at all. And that is the strategy. I don't know what happened in the UK to try to fight that. But in the short run, there was nothing that could be done. Certainly what you didn't want to do was make people's lives even more difficult, which is what they did. In the long run, what they did was people learned to, shift different production processes, shifted away from oil. It made finding oil in the North Sea profitable. It wasn't before. And so they found more oil. And unfortunately, it made fracking. Well, but that was much later. So the only solution was political or political A, and B, a long-term, learning to be less dependent on oil. But did we approach it the right way, William, which was your question? In the US, absolutely not. Now, here's the really unfortunate thing, is that oil prices started to come down not long after that. And so they're all patting themselves on the back. Aha, we did it. We solved inflation. When in fact, and I love doing this with my students, what two countries went to war, and was it 1980 or 79, that have almost the exact same name? And then they eventually get around to Iran, Iraq. I said, that's right. Iraq invaded Iran, hoping that the Iranian Revolution would make it, well, we're going to go in there and they'll just collapse. Well, instead, it was like the movie Independence Day, where the aliens come to Earth and we all get together. Well, that's what Iran did. They all got together. It actually united the country in a way that Saddam Hussein was not expecting. And while the other, OPEC countries are still restricting the supply, they're like, screw this. We're going to sell more oil because, we need the money for the war. And then everyone else is saying, well, if they're cheating, I'm cheating. And so the whole, cartel fell apart, and oil prices not only slowed down their rate of increase, but actually decreased. So that's what solved the war. That's what solved the inflation.
Leading into the Thatcher government, they used that as an excuse to completely disable the unions.
Yes.
And that was inflation became a huge political benefit to them. And also at that time, we had North Sea oil coming on stream. So right. there was a revenue stream coming in as well at that time. So, but inflation absolutely fundamentally laid the ground for neoliberalism in the UK. And that's a concern that we've got, is that because people are seeing inflation tick up again, that there's going to be this remember the 1970s. And that's really what I wanted to get out from you today, is that it's a completely different situation. And I'd love you to just very briefly tell our audience why inflation in the 1970s is so different from the type of inflation that we would experience now.
Right. As a matter of fact, I have a chapter forthcoming in a book put together by MMT Scotland. And one of the things I addressed in there was the 1973 IMF crisis. Is that what it was? And not to go into that, but once again, if you read the background on it, there wasn't a crisis. The Liberal Party, not Labor, Liberal Party, they wanted to go neoliberal. And so they used it as an excuse. And so they didn't even need Thatcher at that point. But anyway, so no, in the 1970s, that inflation, again, always start with redistribution of income. Who is getting wealthier? And does that make me happy or sad? It can really be that simple. In the 1970s, who was getting wealthier? Oil companies, the state of Texas, and the oil exporters. Well, as I said earlier, there's not much we could have done about it because it was a political issue. But no, it doesn't make me very happy. Especially, we are privileged. What about people in the developing world who depended heavily on oil? This created massive debt. in the developing world. We had the whole petrodollar recycling phenomenon. So the 1970s inflation, ask yourself who was better off, and do you think that was beneficial or harmful? Now, today, as the economy is taking off in the US and we see prices rising, used cars, as I mentioned earlier, and also, we see lots of those help wanted signs right now at like fast food restaurants and restaurants. They can't get enough workers. So they're going to bid up the wages of those workers. I'm okay with that. I don't have a problem with that. That's a different source of inflation. The people who will be getting wealthier, I'm okay with them getting wealthier. The people who got wealthier when we needed more medicinal alcohol, I was okay with that. The people who got wealthier when we needed more ceiling fans in the 70s, that's okay because it performed. There's some Scottish guy named Adam Smith who talked about this, and he said, well, the invisible hand, that we're helping other people without intending to do so, and that can happen. In general, I think that there's some serious flaws in the capitalist system, but there are times where, like, okay, good, that'll cause more ceiling fans to be produced. Could we get the government involved too? Sure, if it's a desperate need, but you have to ask right now, and you can look up the data. As I said, U.S. inflation numbers just came out today, and they showed where the prices went up the most. Okay, am I okay with that or not? So
most advanced economies have actually lived through a deflationary period. I mean, certainly throughout my lifetime, I'll be 55 this year. A lot of things that were incredibly expensive even 10 years ago. I'm thinking, for example, a laptop, and how incredibly that expensive that fold away computer was when it first arrived on the scene. But on the whole, my understanding is that, advanced economies have experienced deflation partly because aging populations was one of the reasons. I also wondered if perhaps that people like myself are very much more tuned into ecology and are concerned about just not buying stuff I don't need, or in fact buying it secondhand if possible as well.
I think that probably a lot more has to do with outsourcing. If I can get someone to do this for $10 an hour instead of 35, and for them to be able to work over an open flame while in a gasoline suit because there are no regulations here, it's going to be a lot cheaper. And that's, speaking of Will Milberg, one of the things he talks about in his book on international trade is this massive influx of new labor that took place. First of all, when the Berlin Wall fell. And so now we have all these workers that have been added in at lower wages. And then, of course, we have, firms exploiting labor in Indonesia and in the Far East. So I think that probably most of the decline in prices comes from that. I mean, I'm sure almost every bit of this was made in China. So
we've externalized inflation.
Yeah. And what we did was, well, as William pointed out, we beat the unions to death. And of course, they did that in the U.S. as well when under Reagan. I think a big part of any deflation comes from the fact that we've driven wages way down.
Central banks still have price stability as their core function. So is curbing inflation so important that it seems to trump all other objectives in the economy?
Please don't use that word that you just used. Trump.
Oh, okay.
But you'd be surprised how many Trump flags there still are up here in Texas. Great. So I would start off by saying I wouldn't call inflation good or bad. Again, immediately check who is gaining, who is losing. So always that's the question. Inflation is simply a side effect of a redistribution of income. Then absolutely not. There is no reason for central banks to have as their goal price stability. The real way to control those prices is not going to be through monetary policy, because monetary policy doesn't cause it in the first place. So monetary policy also really doesn't solve it. Let's say that you have an industry that is highly concentrated, like the healthcare industry in the U.S., and you want to, pull prices down because year after year, I know you've seen these numbers. Americans pay more per capita on healthcare than anybody else on the planet, and we rank like 35th in life expectancy. So you'd expect a little better than that. So the way to control that, though, is through either government regulation, or break up the healthcare firms, or gosh, what a radical idea that every other developed nation on the planet already has, and that is having public health. But it makes no sense. Their goal should be full employment, and that's it. So the inflation, even if it becomes a problem, which it absolutely can, it's not dealt with by monetary policy.
The ECB just released their latest monetary guidance, and I'd like your help on this because it says the ECB adopts symmetric 2% inflation target over medium term. Now, any idea what that means and what impact that target's likely to have for the euro and beyond? So it was the symmetric 2% inflation over the medium term.
Oh, I get it. All right, I see. Apparently, and I just looked it up. Google tells us, or Wikipedia tells us, that symmetric inflation targeting is that we're going to try to control inflation if it goes above or below the target. All right. So as opposed to, well, we're okay if it goes below, but we don't want it to go above. That's not the case. Symmetric is both directions. And gosh, 2% is I don't know if you've noticed this, but the European Union tends to be set up for France and Germany, and not so much for everyone else. And it's everyone else that's going to have a terrible problem with that. And they're going to be told that they need to tighten their belts so that they can get 25% unemployment and things like this. No, that makes no sense to me.
Great, and that is over the medium term. So I think that's giving them a little bit of leeway over the next 2 to 5 years. But you can definitely say that longer into medium term, that they're still going to be looking for this tight fiscal policy.
Right.
John, you mentioned that full employment should be the target for central banks. Could you tell me what NERU is? And Kieran has referred to as the nefarious NERU, and I'd love to know what that is in terms of inflation and how it relates to full employment.
Non-accelerating inflationary
rate of unemployment.
Yeah. And again, this one's locked into the idea that all inflation is bad and that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, such that when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up because there's more competition, say in the labor market, for example. And when unemployment goes up, inflation comes down because there's excess laborers, and so we don't have to pay as much. The economy is all about the laborers. I mean, it should not be a target that, as Pavlina Chernova says, just the right amount of unemployment. So that's what NERU is about, to have just the right amount of unemployment. How do we know it's just right? Inflation is not accelerating. It's at 2% and staying there, or at 3% and staying there, or whatever. And first off, I would say that the kind of inflation caused that is trying to address, wherein you have low unemployment, I say let that inflation go. This is redistributing income to workers that are highest demand, and very likely the workers who have been most screwed. It's not, when unemployment's really low, it's not that, oh no, CEO wages are being bid up. It's that, oh no, McDonald's wages are being bid up. Let it happen. But and it's also related to, but not the same as, Milton Friedman's idea of the natural rate of unemployment. That there's a rate towards which the economy is automatically attracted. All right, and it can change over time, which, by the way, if it's your theory, makes it really convenient. That's it right now. And the definition that he gives, which I've shared with my class before, something online, it's when all markets clear. It's a very fuzzy definition. God works in mysterious ways. And so does the natural rate of unemployment. But NERU is used as an inflation, just the right amount of unemployment to keep inflation from accelerating. Well, good Lord, during the 70s, that wouldn't have worked at all, because when the oil prices went up and the inflation went up, so did the unemployment. So now what is our NERU? 50% unemployment? I don't know. It's a very damaging concept.
Yeah.
We all know about this traditional definition of inflation, that there's too much money chasing too few products and services. But I wanted to ask about another form of inflation, the inflation caused by monopolistic pricing. What role does this tend to play in an economy, and why don't we ever hear about this type of inflation?
Yeah, that used to be actually a big topic. And I assume under Thatcher as well, under Reagan, we stopped enforcing antitrust laws. because if the market's doing it, it must be right. But that fits exactly into what I'm trying to talk about here. Just because there's inflation isn't good or bad. Who's getting the money? Well, if it's monopolistic firms that are able to, by whatever means, control the market, then it's not good. They are attracting more resources than consumers really want them to have. Right? So absolutely. And of course, you can't address monopolistic inflation, which is the kind that, well, OPEC was a perfect example of that on a global scale, but you can't address it with monetary policy. It's impossible. There's no way you can do that.
There's a huge amount of monopolistic pricing going on in the UK. And the amount of assets that we have privatized and given over to monopolistic company pricing is huge. And we know that's a huge problem and with any percentage of inflation, but it's something that not only do people know about, I don't think many people even think about. So it's important, I think, that we kind of cover that when we're looking at inflation.
Right, I totally agree. And that's what I say in class is I differentiate between demand-driven inflation. We want more medicinal, alcohol or whatever, versus the sort of supply side driven kind, which is what you're talking about. And the Economist even came out with a piece not too terribly long ago, talking about how much more concentrated industries are becoming in the West. And this is, I can now be a hardcore, Adam Smith supporter and say that's bad. That the point was competition. The only way you get the good outcomes that are supposedly accompanying capitalism is with competition. But no, that is absolutely a huge issue. And that piece on that I have at Forbes on money growth doesn't cause inflation, I have a follow-up piece the next day or so. It's actually my most read piece is what actually causes inflation. And it goes into that as well. But you're absolutely right. And you're right. People don't know about it. And of course, and this is a different topic, but we're privatizing all these. We're starving public industry, if you will, and then blaming it for its failure, and then privatizing it. And the same thing's happened over here, although we don't have nearly as much public, services to start with.
That's what's happening with the NHS in England and a little bit to a lesser extent Scotland, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
So thanks again for coming and speaking, and we'll hopefully we will speak to you again, John.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I can share a glass of Lefroy with you at some point.
One day, yes.
Thanks so much. Thanks, John. Bye now. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. That's the third time I've watched it, and I'm still scribbling, making notes from the stuff that John said. Kieran, what did you think of the interview, and are you got any takeaways? Oh, I can't hear. I can't hear you. I'll just double check and see if our audience can.
Hi,
can you
sorry.
Oh,
is that
there
me
you
now?
are. Hello
Yeah,
again.
sorry. I should have taken myself off of mute. That would help. So the first point that John makes is that inflation is an average of goods and services. And I think that's an important take home for a lot of people. I think a lot of people confuse inflation as described by economists with asset price inflation. And I think the other important point he makes was that who benefits, and are you okay with that? How do you feel about that? Is that okay? And then the third point that I really took home as well was his thoughts about deflation, and that really it's advanced economies have outsourced it and externalized it.
Great, yeah. I think I've got about 15 takeaways from that talk, so really interesting. I'd love to know what people who are watching and watch it on playback, what their takeaways. If they could drop that into the comments, that'd be great. I like the difference between the supply side inflation and the demand side inflation. I thought that was really interesting, and someone on Twitter today was talking about the inflation caused by banks lending on houses and everything else. So I'm going to look into that. I think it's really fascinating when we're looking at inflation. So in terms of the comments, we had a couple of shouts out for Adam Smith. who he's obviously is no longer with us, but I'm sure he'll appreciate that. Yeah, just I think that the point I wanted to get across is that inflation has been this kind of thing that we've always been really scared by, and I'm really pleased that our audience who follow us on Twitter at SCOTONOMICS1, I did a little poll. I don't know if you've seen the result of this, but in the poll yesterday I said, ahead of tomorrow's episode on inflation, we asked the most basic question: is inflation in a modern economy A, evil, end at all costs, 0%, so smart cookies here, good and bad, it depends, 85%, and then people said it's a really good thing, 15%. So 85% of the audience, I think, already agreeing with I think my kind of summary of what John was saying, and what you picked up as well, is that ask who that money is going to before you decide if it's a good or bad thing or not.
Yeah, and the comparison he makes with the MMT scholars about, someone's money somewhere is someone else's, someone's debt is someone's savings. There are two sides to it, so you have to look at what's going on, as a politician would need to do. I know that for politicians, inflation's toxic, and this is why they try to avoid it, because it will take them out of office, and this is what they fear. And yeah, I mentioned the NERU as well for that reason.
Yeah, you're absolutely bang on there. If you're trying to rerun and you to get back into government, and your government was running and inflation was at double digits, that's it. It just seems like that's the end of the end of your campaign. It's still such a toxic thing to happen. Well, that's inflation. Next episode in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to look at what I think is an even more interesting topic, and this is around the measurement of an economy: GDP, GNP. What does that tell us? How are we supposed to run our economy based on these things? When we look at growth figures, is this all that we're really concentrating on? So that's a fascinating topic. We haven't done the interview yet. Karen, do you want to tell us a little bit about the couple of people we've got to cover that for us in a couple of weeks?
So, yeah, I'm delighted that we have managed to get Gav and Pete from the Economics in 10 podcast. If anyone of our audience has ever listened to them, they're a couple of economics teachers, and it's probably the loveliest podcast. I think they enjoy a glass of wine while they're doing it as well, and I really like it. It's maybe not always very highbrow, but it's always very entertaining. So look forward to having
that sounds like this interview with John will only be your favourite interview for about 2 weeks, until we do that one. I think I might have a little whiskey, if that's of the flavour of the interview. Well, thanks very much everyone for joining us. We've now got our website, which is all up and running and is hosting some of our blogs, and it also hosts our interviews that Karen and I have done, so you get to know us a little bit better, and also a shortcut to some of our shows. So check that out at scotonomics.scot, and please do follow us on Twitter at SCOTONOMICS1, and until a couple of weeks' time, bye for now.
Bye everyone. Bye-bye.